So I think a lot of us have been looking around at our country the last decade or so and been thinking to ourselves, this place has gotten a little bit nuts. And it's been very quick. It's been accelerated. We feel like there's ideas or concepts that became popular in a relatively short period of time. And it seems like they came out of nowhere, but they didn't. There was actually quite the lead into all of this. And in fact, today we're going to talk about someone who we think is the most dangerous Marxist you've never heard of. And what's fascinating about this guy is that if you go back and you look at his history, you can kind of understand where he was coming from. And that's going to be one of the things we do today. We're going to try to identify who this guy is, what his theories were, and his perspective, right? Where was he coming from as he laid out this process whereby his ideology, his political beliefs could become dominant in a society that, at least at the onset, completely rejected all of them. And it's amazing to see how successful his strategy has been. So we're going to look at that. We're going to look at the man. We're going to look at the perspective. We're going to look at the strategy. And then we're going to answer the very important question of, how do you fight back against it? And spoiler alert, it's not just by voting harder. All of that coming up on this episode of Making the Argument. I'm your host, Nick Freitas. With me in the studio, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone.
And then, of course, we have our resident historian who did a lot of resident historianing for this episode, as well as our political prognosticator, the Oracle of Virginia, Christian Hines. How are you doing?
You could have just called it research.
I like what I did. I that word identifies as better than research.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this episode, though.
No, this is gonna be a good one. This is gonna be a good one because I think we're gonna answer a lot of questions in here and share a lot of information that's kind of critical for understanding the larger issues that we've seen going on. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and start with kind of framing all of this. So let's get everyone up kind of the same starting line so we have kind of an understanding of what's going on. Whenever we think of Marxism, we typically think of communism, the Communist Manifesto, Das Kapital, Marx, Engels. And I think most people, especially in the West, we almost view this as, well, this was an economic theory. This was an economic theory about how you distribute resources. Maybe if you've studied a little bit more, you understand that it was kind of more of a comprehensive system that he was looking for. But you don't automatically associate that with queer theory or critical race theory or all of this other, like what we call identity politics. You don't readily associate with wokeism. You don't think of Karl Marx and you don't think the Soviet Union as being woke, right? So whenever we talk about Marxism and wokeism and the connection between the two, I think a lot of people think that all we're doing is we're just trying to put everything into the communism bucket because communism bad. And so therefore, if I can take woke and I can make woke communist, then woke's bad. And that's not actually what we're doing, because in order to truly understand what Marx was getting at, Marx was not just coming up with a unique little new theory about economics. Marx was coming up with a theory of everything. James Lindsay talks a lot about this, where he goes, Marxism is not so much atheist as it is a new religion. And it's a new religion that promises a utopia. So what's the utopia? The utopia is, well, one day we're going to live in this society that doesn't require a government because we have the dictatorship of the proletariat and everyone's equal and there's no classes and there's so much abundance because we're all working in voluntary cooperation with one another through this glorious communist state that we just don't have to fight anymore. We just got to sit around and do the things we want, and we take such pleasure in our labor because we're getting the full value of our contribution, right? That was his utopia, right? The problem that he identified, and there were some legitimate issues that he was bringing up with capitalism. It was this idea of, we have all these people where you have this agrarian society and now people are working in factories, and a lot of it is kind of like just repetitive work, and it could be kind of soul crushing at times. And there was inequalities within society, and some of them were not just based off of people working harder or better or smarter. Some of it was very aristocratic. And so it was easy to point to some of these inequalities within society and say, this feels arbitrary. This feels like wrong. And so he talked a lot about social justice and greater equality. And let's face it, if you're somebody that's working 14 hours, a day in a factory to try to make ends meet, yeah, you might actually be better off economically than you would be if you were working somewhere else. This might actually be an opportunity, because one of the things that you saw within the Industrial Revolution is a massive increase in population, a massive increase in overall wealth. And it wasn't just for the people at the top. That's the caricature. but you still might have found yourself in a society where you felt disconnected with everybody else. And so Marx was addressing these things, and he was saying, well, the way that we're going to go from where you have it right now, where you're working all this time and you feel like you're constantly struggling to get to the workers' paradise, the utopia, the way we're going to get through that is through communism. It's through and communism requires revolution. You need to recognize that you're not just being oppressed by your employer, you're actually being oppressed by all of society. And the way that we're going to have to break away from that is we're going to have to create the new socialist man. And the way Marx thought that would come about. So you got the problem, and he's addressing some real issues. And you got the heaven, right? You got the communist version of heaven, the Marx version of heaven. And then you have the way that you're going to get there. And the way that you're going to get there is we're going to seize the means of production. We're going to abolish private property. We're going to seize all of these tyrannical structures. And the tyrannical structure was not just the king. It was not just your boss or the bourgeoisie. It was the family. Right? It was all of these traditional structures. It was religion. It was God. All of these structures were keeping you oppressed. And by throwing those structures off and adopting the communist view of the world, that this was all about economic struggles in between the classes, and that the path was to level out all the classes by the people seizing the means of production and abolishing private property, this was what was going to lead to the ultimate utopia. And the way Marx thought it would happen was not in like these super poor, what we might call like, rural or agrarian or even feudal countries. He didn't think it was going to happen there. He thought it was going to happen in the capitalist countries. It was going to be the countries that had embraced capitalism, that had engaged in industrial development. And what was going to happen, according to Marx, is the internal contradictions of capitalism were going to create the environment where the workers finally just had enough of it. And they rose up and they rebelled and they overthrew their capitalist oppressors, and they took control of the means of society, from the state to education to everything else. Here's the problem. It didn't happen that way. Now you might be saying, well, wait a second, Nick, the Soviet Union, what about other countries that we saw whether it was Cuba or whether it was Angola or whether it was all these other places in the world that did in fact embrace and adopt and attempt communism? What about China? Yeah, the problem is none of those countries, especially the two biggest ones, right? The Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, none of these countries are countries that were experiencing late stage capitalism. In fact, the countries that were more capitalistic, right? Western Europe, these were the countries that were actually resisting communism. And all of a sudden, there was this crisis. There was this crisis going on among many communists where they said, I like what Karl Marx is offering. I agree with the problem that he's identified. I agree with the sort of heaven he wants to create, the heaven on earth he wants to create. I even agree that there needs to be revolution in order to achieve it. But it's not happening the way Marx said. And so you had people start to ask why. And then they took it a step further. It's like, okay, if I still want what Marx is offering, but it didn't happen the way he said, how do we get it to happen the way we want? Why didn't it work? And how do we come up with a blueprint in order to make sure that it works going forward? And that is where Antonio Gramsci enters the chat. So, Christian, let's take a look real quick before we get into the whole idea of, Marx. We've already established that, look, anybody that's followed me for more than 5 seconds knows what I think of Marxism, knows what I think of communism, knows what I think of socialism. But I don't want to caricature anything here, right? Marx had some legitimate critiques. I think what he offered as a solution was horrible, but he had some legitimate critiques. And to prove this point, one of the contemporary economists that I love the most is Thomas Sowell. And Thomas Sowell, growing up as a poor kid who had essentially been orphaned in Brooklyn, New York, high school dropout, he's looking around at the world and he's saying, yeah, Marx's explanation makes sense to me. Thomas Sowell, of all people, lived the first half of his young life as a committed Marxist. Let's take a look at Antonio Gramsci and kind of look at his perspective or his worldview and feel like, okay, why might Antonio Gramsci have come to the same conclusions that a young, poor Thomas Sowell came to growing up in New York City?
Well, in a lot of respects, they had kind of similar backgrounds. So Gramsci was born in 1891 on the island of Sardinia, which, fun fact, is actually where my family is from on my grandmother's side. My great-grandfather was born on the same island as him 8 years later in 1899. And Gramsci came from a relatively poor family. Like, they were lower middle class. You could argue they were working class. They weren't necessarily like poor peasants.
They weren't destitute,
but they were not even close to being wealthy.
Mhm.
And his father got in trouble with the law several times. He was like a really low-level bureaucrat. He had dreams to like become a lawyer and support his family, but he fell out with the wrong crowd, or fell in with the wrong crowd and fell out with the right crowd. And ended up being prosecuted, arguably on kind of politically motivated, trumped-up charges, and he was sent to prison. That did throw the family into poverty.
Yeah.
Because then he was just raised by his mother, and he had like 6 or 7 siblings. And Gramsci was also like really sickly as a kid. He ended up having a lot of health problems, and because he didn't really have proper medical treatments, especially back then, late 19th century, early 20th century, he ended up developing a hunchback. He was under 5 feet tall. He was like 4'11" or 4'10". And he was kind of dealt a really, really bad set of cards in his early life.
You think about this as kind of like a formative thing for him very, very early on. And this is something too that we're actually, I think we've always kind of intuitively understood it to some degree, but it was dismissed. And now we're seeing the scientific evidence and the research to demonstrate how early we develop our view of the world, our view of relationships, our view of justice. These things happen a lot earlier than I think we ever fully appreciated before. And so from an early age, Gramsci's in a position where he's seeing his, father barely being able to keep the family afloat. And then he feels probably to some degree that he was unjustly prosecuted. So now the state or the powers that be have been his enemy. Now he's living in abject poverty. He's got physical deformities. He's got or sicknesses and whatnot that hinder him significantly and put him in a position where he can't, again, keeping in mind, we're talking about economies that were still very much dependent upon hard labor and things of that nature, especially if you were
still
poor.
a fairly rural agrarian society.
Especially if you're poor, right? Especially if you're poor. But the one thing he's got going for him is intellectually, he's brilliant.
He was definitely brilliant. That's what's so interesting about Gramsci, because we one of the things that I think Nick and I enjoy doing is, certainly in our spare time, but also on this podcast, is it's really easy to just like dehumanize your enemies.
Mm-hmm.
It's very easy to do that. We all do it to some degree, but if you really want to understand why things are the way that they are, and especially if you want to understand how to address those problems, to some degree, you actually have to rehumanize your enemies. You have to try to look at the world from their eyes. Mm-hmm. And so from the perspective of Gramsci as a kid, especially as he's getting into his teenage years, and then finally he's going off to university, to your point, he's brilliant. I despise his politics, but I can't, look, the guy wrote like 3,000 pages worth of notes when he was in prison, and we'll get to that in a minute.
Yeah.
But one of the things that he was able to do, despite all of his setbacks, is he got a full scholarship to arguably the most prestigious university in Italy at the time, the University of Turin, on the mainland in northern Italy. And so he went there to study, and he ended up rising through the ranks pretty quickly. He was considered absolutely brilliant when it came to linguistics. He was very well read, and he would attend multiple lectures on some of the pretty much the highest ranking Italian philosophers at the time, which actually kind of gave him a unique grounding for when he became a Marxist later in life, because he was listening to lectures when he was in university on philosophy and politics from individuals that weren't Marxists. Mm-hmm. And so he got a lot of influence from Italian idealists and from members, acolytes within Italian elite theory. And so some of the things that, and if you read his notes, you actually end up getting that he's a Marxist, but in many respects, he's not a materialist. And he's also not a believer in necessarily populist movements so much as he is in elitist movements to bring about a Marxist type outcome.
This is also kind of an interesting part to talk about. He gets into the university. I believe he had to leave, right, because of lack of funds.
Yeah.
So right off the bat, now you have another situation which is kind of reinforcing his worldview that well, I'm smart enough to be here, but I'm not rich enough to be here. And then there's people that are not smart enough to be here, but they're rich enough to be here. And so once again, you see an inequality that seems to fly in the face of what should be justice, right? So he becomes the leader of the Communist Party in Italy.
This is like right after World War I.
Yeah. And here's what's important to understand too about what was going on, because Mussolini started off a socialist. Hitler started off as socialist. So why was there this departure from what you might call universal socialism or Marxism, this idea of workers of the world unite? And this is actually something that, the author of Liberal Fascism writes about, Jonah Goldberg. He said, one of the things that it's not that Mussolini was rejecting all aspects of communism or socialism, because they still describe themselves as National Socialist on some level or fascist in Italy. What they were rejecting was this notion that that me as a laborer at a particular economic level or a particular economic status or class, that I have more in common with somebody on the other side of the world in that same class than I do with somebody in my own country one class above. And so it was this idea of they liked a lot of the notions about socialist central planning, economic policy, unions, all that stuff. They were all for it. That's one of the amazing things is I like to go to college campuses and I read them off the Italian Fascist Manifesto, and I ask them, do you believe this is, I don't tell them what it is. I just read it off. I said, would you consider this left wing or right wing? And universally, all the students go, oh, that's all left wing. Yeah, that's all leftist policy. I'm like, that's the Italian Fascist Manifesto. Like, what? It never occurred to them. But it's this idea of national identity. It's this idea that, yes, you may be the manager at the factory and I may be the worker at the factory, but you and I go to the same church, speak the same language, eat the same food. Our kids might go to the same school. And so there was this still sense of shared history and shared identity, which transcends the economic. And so part of what, Mussolini was rejecting about communism, especially the version of communism where you had to pledge your loyalty to the Soviet Comintern, right, or Lenin, was this idea that, well, no, I like what you're trying to do economically, and I like the egalitarianism, and I believe the state should play this role within society, and I hate capitalism, but I don't reject being Italian. Right? I'm not being communist and being loyal to the Soviet is not going to be the primary push in my identity. I'm still Italian. I still believe in the greatness of Italy, but I want to adopt these economic policies. And so a lot of people have this idea that fascism's way over here and communism's way over here. That's not true. There's actually a lot of similarities with respect to central planning, economic leveling, the problems that they identify, their frustration with capitalism, et cetera. A lot of it's centered around this idea of where do you get kind of that core notion of your identity and your sense of community. And so Gramsci is obviously, Mussolini hates Gramsci, puts him in jail, but Mussolini also recognized what a threat Gramsci was. They recognized how convincing he was, the arguments that he would make. They said I think they wanted to put his ideas, they needed to lock away his ideas for 20 years or something like that.
Yeah, after Gramsci becomes the head of the Communist Party of Italy, Mussolini takes power. Well, it's around the same time. Mussolini takes power in 1922, but he doesn't really consolidate it until 26. It takes him about 4 years for him to actually become, the dictator of Italy. And in that process, he ends up arresting Gramsci, who's a member of the Italian parliament. So he violates the parliamentary immunity and, throws him in prison. And at his trial, it's obviously a rigged trial. The prosecutor says that we need to stop this guy's brain from functioning for 20 years, is what he says. And so Gramsci's sent to prison for 20 years, but he doesn't live that long because he's in poor health. And obviously he's in even poorer health when he's in prison. And so Gramsci spends the rest of his life, the last 11 years, in prison, and they move him around from place to place. And what's interesting is that Mussolini never killed him. And near the end of his life, Mussolini almost released him from prison on humanitarian grounds because he was doing so poorly. But Gramsci passed away before he was to be released. He was supposed to be released early, but like I said, he was just in such poor health that he passed away. But while he was in prison for 11 years, from 1926 to 1937 when he died, he had a lot of time on his hands, and one of the things that he was able to do was articulate all sorts of thoughts about almost everything you can think of. Things that some things that aren't even political. I mean, he wrote a whole history of he wrote a whole history of Italian politics.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote some discourses on Machiavelli. He wrote a little bit about poetry and philosophy. But one of the biggest questions that he asked, and he wrote about 3,000 pages that are called his prison notebooks. And they're kind of messy. They're all over the place. But one of the things that was compiled is a series of selections on it. And I actually have a PDF of it pulled up here. We're not going to go through all 800 pages, but I just want to pull it up just that way the audience can see it, because if they're interested, they can read the whole thing, all 844 pages themselves.
Yeah.
There's parts of it that are kind of dry, but then there's other parts that I think are absolutely brilliant. And if you're into it, I would recommend you do it. But if you see here, he has stuff about history and culture, and we'll go through a little bit of this. He talks about intellectuals. He talks about education. Those two things are going to be very important.
Yep.
He talks about his own notes on Italian history, like I said, and then notes on politics. He touches on Machiavelli. He touches on Marx, obviously. He talks about political parties. He even talks a little bit about the United States in certain parts. And then he talks about the state and civil society. And then some of his own ideas, like his concept of praxis, his concept of the war of position. And these are things that we'll get to later on. But the central focus is he's trying to answer one critical question. And you hinted at it earlier at the start of this podcast. Why did Lenin succeed in Russia and I failed in Italy? Because they were both trying to do something very similar, which is seize power and bring about a communist utopia.
Yeah.
And Lenin had achieved his ends. He didn't achieve the utopia, right? But he seized power through the October Revolution, and then finally the Civil War. Well, Gramsci had kind of tried that with the workers' uprisings in Turin in 1920, and then finally him becoming the head of the Communist Party in 1921, and then his duels politically with Mussolini from 22 to 26, but he failed. And so his 11 years in prison, all of this, in a sense, is his attempt to answer that critical question of why am I sitting in a prison cell and Lenin is running the Soviet Union?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think, and I would even go a little bit past that to say that he was also, there was this expectation, again, that this was going to be it should have been more successful. If you look at where Italy was at in the 1920s and you look at where Tsarist Russia was at, or you look where Russia was at during World War I and whatnot, you probably would have thought Italy was more likely to go the communist route than you would Russia if you followed Marx. And you could have thought the same thing about elements of France, the UK, and other countries as well. And yet it was Russia. And so a big part of his work is dedicated to answering that question and then figuring out how to correct for it. And he has kind of 4 categories that he lays out. It's the role of intellectuals, cultural hegemony and the war of position, the state and civil society, and the long march to the institutions. And what we're going to go right through right now is kind of a brief overview of each one of these concepts. What was the central theme of what he was trying to get at? And so let's start with the role of the intellectuals, because this is pretty important.
Yeah, so intellectuals are the centerpiece of Gramsci's worldview, his unique blend of Marxism. And he argues that basically all men are actually intellectuals. All men have the capacity to engage in intellect in some activity. Even the most menial aspects of manual labor involve some sort of intellect, right? Like a mechanic working on a car, that's not super menial, right? But a mechanic working on a car is an intellect when it comes to how to work on a car.
Yeah.
Even somebody who's just digging holes in the desert, needs to know how to work a spade, right? And so what he's trying to get across is that the concept that intellectuals, what we call the intelligentsia, the idea that they're their own separate social group, he argues that that's not true. And so he differentiates 2 different types of intellectuals. He says that there's the traditional intellectuals, the intelligentsia, the ones who falsely believe that they're their own separate class, distinct from everybody else. And then there's organic intellectuals. And he says that organic intellectuals, they pop up everywhere in society, all social groups, all classes. Every collection of people have produced naturally their own organic intellectuals.
Well, and to give an idea, Thomas Sowell wrote, going back to Thomas Sowell, he wrote a book called Intellectuals in Society. And the way that he defined intellectuals were people whose function within society, whose primary role was coming up with ideas, concepts, philosophies. And then he added something on it as kind of a dig. He goes, for which they pay no personal price for being wrong. And what he was largely referring to is what we might more specifically call academia. Whereas he said, so someone in academia that's discussing political philosophy, or and he brings up several intellectuals that talked about things way outside their field of study. They were considered experts because they were PhDs, but then they talked about things that had nothing to do with what their specific focus was. And he said these people can imagine a way to reorder society. They can imagine new political systems. They can imagine new ways to, conduct economics or whatever it is. But they never actually have to go into the real world and prove that it works. And in fact, when somebody tries to implement their idea and fails, they get to sit back from a safe distance and say, well, that wasn't a faithful attempt, or that wasn't a real communism's never been tried, right? It's this idea that they can come up with these ideas and they have tenure. So it doesn't matter if they get it wrong. Right? They can still sell a book. They can just move on to a different subject as if everything they said before wasn't proven, wrong, or at least demonstrated to be problematic. And he said, whereas on the other side, if you're an architect, if you're an engineer, if you engage in any of what you might call the hard sciences, if you have this grandiose notion of how a building should be constructed and it collapses, you are at the very least out of the job, right? You are not getting paid anymore. You could be in jail, right? Like you could be getting sued civilly or criminally, but you're definitely not making any more buildings for the most part. And what he talks about is this idea that what happens within academia is people basically are able to rise to the top within a particular field based off of their ability to appeal to other academics. Whereas the kind of organic intellectuals that Gramsci is talking about right now are people that generally rise to a certain degree of prominence within a field based off of their ability to actually do something successful within that field. And so there's this tendency that takes place where you have these people that rise up. So let's give an example of this.
Gramsci actually does give an example.
Yeah.
In his own works. And I'll read out the page numbers. That way, if the audience ever wants to, they can go and find it themselves. In his selected works on the prison notebooks, on page 133, he says that the capitalist entrepreneur, sorry, this is actually page 132. He says the capitalist entrepreneur creates alongside himself the industrial technician, the specialist in political economy, the organizers of a new culture, of a legal system, etc. And then he goes on to say that if not all entrepreneurs, at least an elite among them must have the capacity to be an organizer of society in general. It can be observed that the organic intellectuals in every new class creates alongside itself and elaborates in the course of its development are for the most part specializations of partial aspects of this primitive activity. And so he concludes that like the entrepreneur himself represents a higher social elaboration. He must be an organizer of men. He must be the organizer of the confidence of the investors in a business, of the consumers of his product, etc. And so on your point, in a way, Gramsci might actually agree with Sowell in that respect. And what's so interesting is he's referring to a capitalist class, one that supposedly he wants to overthrow, and he's saying that even within there, they're producing organic intellectuals who they do pay a price for being wrong. I mean, he says that they have to manage the confidence of investors in his business. Well, what happens if they lose the confidence of those investors, right? The business might go bankrupt.
Yeah.
And so that's like a perfect example of an organic intellectual emerging within what he would call a capitalist class.
Well, and he's also, so like if we take two examples of Noam Chomsky and Elon Musk. So Noam Chomsky is actually an expert in his field of linguistics, but he writes all kinds of books about political philosophy and everything else for which, not to say he can't write or have insights into that, but that's not exactly what his academic, prowess or field of study was. Noam Chomsky, in order to be successful within his environment, has to appeal to other people that are going to read his books, which is actually limited to other academics. But what it means is you have to establish an infrastructure around that intelligentsia in order to prop it up. In the private sector, or what we might call the organic sector, if Elon Musk had set up Tesla and then none of his cars drove, nobody would know who Elon Musk was. But because he's had a series of successes combined with his ability to kind of talk about those successes and be able to, promote them and everything else, he is also part of what, he would consider an intelligentsia. And the reason why he's saying this is important to understand is because, and this kind of goes into the cultural hegemony and war of position that we'll get in next, it's this idea that you're not just trying to overthrow an economic system. There's actually a culture which is brought up, which protects itself. So the entrepreneur, the people that are successful and they organize men and they build these successful businesses, they're creating a culture around what they do in order to protect what they do. And Gramsci is recognizing this, is that there's a larger cultural consideration. It's not just a bunch of academics up at, it's not just the philosophers and the poets. It's also the people doing this work who have respect within their field and who actually set up, organizations, clubs, memberships, everything else that is designed to protect that particular position. Is that a decent way of explaining it?
Yes.
Okay.
And on that front, a great way to help illustrate the importance of his concepts of like cultural hegemony is that he goes on to say in some of his notes that he gives another example of the church actually.
Mm-hmm.
And believe it or not, even though he's an atheist, he respects the Catholic Church quite a lot for the fact that it was able to maintain its power and status in society for basically 1,000 years. And he points out that feudal lords also are producing their own kind of specialized technicians or experts, right, or intellectuals. And in this case, he calls it, he brings up the example of the clergy.
Yeah.
And he says that he gives this example and he says, it is to be noted that the mass of the peasantry, although it forms an essential function in the world of production, that goes back to the old Marxist roots, does not elaborate on its own organic intellectuals, nor does it assimilate any stratum of traditional intellectuals. So he's pointing out that the peasantry are the one group that don't produce their own intellectuals. Well, that's interesting because if they're not producing their own intellectuals, then where are they getting knowledge from? Well, they're getting it from elsewhere. Somebody else is forming their worldview. I think you know where we're about to go with this, right? Because if somebody else is forming their worldview, then basically they can be manipulated, they can be controlled, they can be living in somebody else's reality. And he says that basically the reality that they're living in is one that the, quote, monopoly held by the ecclesiastics in the superstructural field was not exercised without a struggle. And so he's saying that it's the church that is controlling the worldview. But what's so interesting is that the church did not hold that monopoly for long. He points out that over time, the monarchy actually grew in power and eventually it became an absolutist monarchy. And on page 138, he says that thus we find the formation of the nobility of the robe, which is different than the old nobility of the sword.
Yeah.
Right? The nobility of the robe is almost like the bureaucrat, whereas the nobility of the sword, they were the ones that fought on the fields. They were the warrior class. And he says that the nobility of the robe with their own privileges, a stratum of administrators, scholars and scientists, theorists, non-ecclesiastical philosophers, etc., they eventually supplanted the church as the driving intellectual force of the age. And so over time you had, and this is where you get some weird analogies of like Italian elite theory, you had this almost circulation of elites within, the intellectuals in society at the end of the Middle Ages going into the early modern period. And the church slowly lost its sway on society. It lost its culturally dominant position. Mm-hmm. And so he's saying that this is why intellectuals are so important. And this is exactly where you get the transition to cultural hegemony, because he says that the mode of being of a new intellectual can no longer consist in eloquence, which is an exterior and momentary mover of feelings and passions, but in active participation in practical life as constructor, organizer, and permanent persuader.
So, all right, so let's break this down. Step one was the role of the intellectuals. He's saying that these intellectuals, this intelligentsia, what they do is they help create culture. And it's not just the academics, it's the actual people within the world, within their communities who take on a position of prominence. And that culture becomes something that you get group identity from, right? So it's not just your economic status. It's this more comprehensive view of your culture as a whole. Then when he gets into cultural hegemony, what he's saying is that, okay, capitalist culture, right? The intelligentsia within capitalist culture creates cultural norms which protect capitalist culture. So if you're coming in and you're simply saying you need to throw off the shackles of your oppression because we're going to make your life better. Well, if you already have a sense of meaning, identity, purpose, you can feed yourself, because let's face it, capitalism actually delivers on the whole being able to feed yourself thing far better than anything that ever came before it. So if you're looking at all of those things, you're looking at this guy going, why would I overthrow the system that I have, when what it really means is you're not just asking me to exchange one economic theory for another, you're asking me to exchange an entire culture for another. That's a far different proposition, right? And it's a culture that, again, now if that culture just did nothing for you, and a lot of the people that are most disaffected, right? Look at Gramsci. He's poor. He's sick. He feels like he feels like he's being pushed down by the culture. He feels like he's being disadvantaged by the culture. He's got a reason to revolt. That doesn't mean the vast majority of the people within that culture have a reason to revolt. And so now he's starting to figure out, like, oh, okay, it's not just economics. It's culture. It's identity. It's a sense of community. It's a sense of purpose. And these are the people that help craft what that looks like. So if I want to overthrow this, if I want to get to Marxism, I need something to compete with culture. So I need the academics, but I also need these organic, intellectuals that are actually going to help create these new cultural norms, these new ways of thinking about society, these new ways of thinking about meaning and purpose and identity and group identity, in order to give people a place to go. Because the economics alone doesn't cut it. That's what, that's where Marx got it wrong. So where does he go from that?
Yeah, so he distinguishes between two different types of political conflict. There's a war of maneuver and a war of position. So the war of maneuver is, the perfect example of this is Lenin in 1917. It's the Russian Civil War. You're taking the guns, you're storming the Winter Palace, you're fighting in the streets, you're shooting at the enemy, right? It's a civil war. But a war of maneuver had failed repeatedly in the West. There had been communist uprisings in Germany after World War I. Mm-hmm. There were leftist and Marxist and communist uprisings in Italy after World War I, some of which Gramsci participated in as an intellectual, not a fighter, obviously. But those had all been crushed. The Marxists failed to seize power militarily. And to your point, this is where the concept of the war of position comes from. Gramsci's arguing you need to win the war of position, and then you can launch a war of maneuver. In fact, you might not even need to launch a war of maneuver if you win the war of position, because to your point, the reason that these revolutions aren't succeeding is because, well, people didn't agree with the Marxists. And Gramsci recognized that. He's sitting in prison. He's like, well, enough people didn't agree with me. Mm-hmm. More people agree with Mussolini. And that's why he won and I lost. Because they bought into what he kind of called a bourgeois culture that produced a fascist government rather than a Marxist government.
Well, you could even argue that what Gramsci is arguing about right here is, because Marx and Lenin and everyone and Gramsci himself were so focused on this idea of revolution, and that it was going to take revolution, it was going to require conflict. This idea that you were just going to peacefully move from late stage capitalism into communism was something that Marx certainly didn't believe. And so they recognized that revolution, and most likely violent revolution, was going to be necessary. But what Gramsci is starting to recognize right here is the necessary preconditions for a successful revolution did not exist in these countries that were trying to push it. You essentially had this kind of arrogance that assumed, oh, we look at the great economic argument we've made. Now let's go to war. And people are looking around going like, I'm not going to shoot the manager that I have dinner with or that my kids go to school with, because he makes, a little bit more an hour than I do. Like that doesn't make sense.
Or here's a better analogy. I'm not going to shoot my fellow class member, mm-hmm. my coworker who's a conservative.
Yeah.
Who goes to church.
Yeah.
Who's a devout Catholic, right? Because from the Marxist position, it should be, well, all the workers should be on the same side. But Gramsci realizes, especially when he's in prison, that is not the case. The working class is not a unified, cohesive bloc that all wants the same thing. They want different things. And he's arguing the reason they want different things is because there's no class consciousness. They're adopting bourgeois culture. And so you have, not all of them, of course, some members of the working class are Marxists. Some of them are communists. Yeah. But a lot of them don't identify as being part of their left-wing interpretation of the working class, they identify with another culture that's kind of been imposed upon them. And so his solution is basically that you need a set of organic intellectuals that represent the wishes of the Marxist interpretation of the working class that will then compete and advocate for a different type of culture to compete with the bourgeois culture that is infected everything within society from Gramsci's standpoint. And if you do that, you will shift the culture in a direction that will then produce a Marxist society eventually. And that's what he means by war of position.
Yeah, think of it as setting the necessary preconditions in order to be able to launch a successful revolution as opposed to a failed one. And those preconditions require the major culturally, for you to actually have representation in majorly culturally shaping institutions, so people feel like they have somewhere to go, right? Because again, their identity is not exclusively held up within their economic status. By the way, have you ever wondered, how do I avoid falling prey to bad ideas such as this one? Well, you're probably hungry. That's what it is. If you're hungry, you're more or less likely to make bad decisions. And that's where Good Ranchers comes in. Because if there's one way to really, really just get on board with this whole idea of freedom and capitalism and property rights, is by going to Good Ranchers. That's right. Go to goodranchers.com, put in my code Nick, and not only are you going to get $40 off your subscription, but you can also get free meat with your subscription. Again, this is Good Ranchers is one of the greatest arguments for capitalism ever, right? Communism produces starvation and oppression, and capitalism produces Good Ranchers, a wonderful family that started a great business where they work with American cattlemen, American ranchers in order to provide you the best beef, pork, poultry, and wild-caught seafood delivered directly to your door. Yay, free markets. So goodranchers.com, use my promo code Nick, get that $40 off and free meat with your subscription. Ladies and gentlemen, it's the middle of summer. You need to be out there barbecuing, and Good Ranchers has got you covered. Go check them out.
Nick, the last two things that I want to bring up on this point that'll feed into the next part about state and civil society is what exactly are they trying to achieve here and through what means? So we talked about like war of position versus war of maneuver and the concept of cultural hegemony, but it's important to understand that like the point of the intellectuals here, the organic intellectuals that are supposed to bring about the type of Marxist future that Gramsci wants, they're not supposed to be injecting a kind of Marxist culture as a foreign notion. What they're really trying to do is make the masses, so to speak, adopt this more Marxist outlook as their own worldview, as their own native way of looking at things, and then using it to critique the status quo. Does that sound familiar at all? You could argue...
it seems like I've seen this happen before.
You could argue that Gramsci, in many respects, is one of the founding fathers of critical theory.
Yeah.
And certainly of modern-day wokeism. Like, without question, I would argue that progressivism, wokeism in the West has more in common with Antonio Gramsci than any Marxist theorist, including Karl Marx himself. Mm-hmm. Because the last thing I'll say on this topic is that Gramsci also had a unique view of Marxism that was different than the classical Marxists. He was not a historical materialist. He adopted a lot of idealism as well. And so therefore, he's infamous for saying things like Marxism is going to be the religion that must replace Christianity.
Yeah.
He doesn't mean this in the sense that you're going to abolish religion. Even though he's an atheist, again, it's weird. He's an atheist, but he's not a materialist. He actually views that history is kind of almost in a way of kind of pulling from Hegel, that history is the unfolding of human activity, and that nothing exists independent of human activity. Well, in a way, this is where you get almost the bizarre form of anti-realism that exists within certain elements of leftism. This is kind of why you get elements of leftism that say things like, biology is a social construct, right?
Well, I think it's important to point out here that it's not as if Gramsci was laying out a blueprint for wokeism, but when you look at the critical theory and how that developed, it was this idea of questioning all of the existing power structures. Because when you look at Herbert Marcuse and the Frankfurt School and what they kind of did and how they ran with some of what Gramsci was talking about, Gramsci was saying, hey, look, you got to find a way to fight against the current cultural norms. You got to find a way to provide meaning and purpose and identity to people because the economic status isn't sufficient. Frankfurt School comes in and critical theory gets developed as this idea of we're going to take the existing cultural structure and we're going to attack it. And how are we going to attack it? Well, we're going to use everything that kind of underlies that structure, whether it be religion, whether it be even Western notions of objective truth, objective morality, logic, the scientific method. And we're going to question all of it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create this idea that all of these things are set up in such a way not to get us to truth, not to get us to better answers about the way the world works or concepts of human nature. No. Those things were all set up as a mechanism to impose power toward the oppressed on behalf of the oppressors, which, if you think about it, we've talked about this before. It's the universal solvent, which you've essentially said is when there's no objective truth, when there's no objective morality, when all of it is subjective, then what ends up happening is you end up with this idea where those of us who were used to operating in a culture where we could appeal to these things and there were shared values, we now find ourselves getting in arguments with people where 1 minute they're using logic, and then the moment when it doesn't work for them, they abandon it as a tool of oppression. And we're sitting here going, wait, what? And it is a very pernicious way to undermine the existing culture. And it's important to understand that's why it was created. It's created as an attack, right? We're going to get to the things that the woke is in many respects too, the way they create their counterculture. But it's also critical theory is this way that they undermine and they attack the existing culture. So where there's nothing for you to be proud about your history. There's nothing for you to be proud about at your institutions. In fact, all of the things that you thought gave you meaning and purpose are either ridiculous, absurd, or oppressive, right? Your religion is oppressive and it's stupid. It's a fairy tale. Right? Oh, and that traditional family you love so much, that's another tool of oppression in order to keep women down and keep them in the house so they can't experience their full expression of humanity within civil and economic society. That school you went to, or that business you're a part of. No, your employer's oppressing you. They're robbing you of your natural way. When you unmoor someone from their history, from their past, and then from all the institutions which give them identity, meaning, and purpose, whether it be transcendental or whether it be like the church, or whether it be in your day-to-day life with respect to shared experiences and struggles, your family, your community. Well, now all of a sudden, everything's gone. You got nowhere to go, and you're looking for something to give you those things that you used to get from those institutions, that you used to get from that culture or that system of belief. And so it becomes this, again, once you start to understand, it was designed to destroy the culture that you grew up in.
It was supposed to dissolve things.
Yes.
I use it as saying that liberalism is a universal solvent, which is more controversial, but certainly what should not be controversial is that critical theory, what we eventually call cultural Marxism, we can debate where those came from, right? But these concepts, these terms, they dissolve all of the things that you just talked about. And well, what happens as a consequence is that it becomes a lot easier for people to be manipulated.
Yeah.
And on this point, the next important topic that we've got to cover here is state and civil society. You hinted at this just a minute ago. Gramsci looks at two things that are traditionally viewed as separate spheres. So on one hand, you have political society. And political society is, courts, laws, legislatures, police, the army. It's things that we associate with governments typically, right? Constitutions, right? Legal systems. And then you look at civil society. So these are things like the church, the family, the education system, culture, the media, academia, and, journalism. And we typically, normally, nowadays, that is not the case, right? But normally, we think that these are separate, that one deals with the realm of politics and elections and, messy things about how to run a government.
Law.
The law. And then the other one is, you living your day-to-day life.
Yeah. Cultural norms, traditions.
Where are we going to eat today?
Yeah.
What church you go to, talking about normal stuff.
And it's also the elements that help govern society and help give us cues and ideas about what we should do in various civil situations for which the law does not inform us.
And Gramsci argues that these are traditionally viewed as separate spheres, but they're actually one sphere. And what's really interesting is that in a way, he is writing this congruently with the concept of the total state. And he's doing it with the concept of Giovanni Gentile's view of, I believe his term is absolute idealism. Giovanni Gentile is considered the intellectual grandfather of fascism, or certainly father, maybe not grandfather, but he is the brains behind Mussolini's political project. When Mussolini famously says, nothing outside the state, I can't remember what the full quote is.
It was like everything in the state, nothing outside the state.
So when we especially in America, when we view that quote, we think that means totalitarian Big Brother 1984, and it can certainly devolve into that. I mean, you can look at what happened in Germany and Italy in the 1930s and 40s and say that that's exactly what happened. But philosophically, that is actually not what they're getting at. What Gentile is trying to get at is that when he says the state, he means society. And so he's lumping all of this in together, and he's saying that no, there is no difference between the government and civil society, because the government is simply the popular expression of the will of a group of people articulating itself through, again, mostly Hegelian forms of idealism. And so he's saying when nothing is outside the state, what he means is that it's the people through their day-to-day activities that naturally will then produce a type of government that is a pure manifestation of the people. So then nothing outside the state really means nothing outside the people. And Gramsci's actually adopting that, in large part because even though they're rivals, there's elements of fascist thought, including Gentile's philosophy, that Gramsci is adopting, which makes him somewhat controversial with certain Marxists that really dig into the weeds on this. But as it relates to us today, well, think about the type of world that we live in today. There's no distinction between political society and civil society today. And whose fault is that? It's the left's fault for doing that. They have created a total state. They have dissolved any sort of boundary between the political and the personal. It's the left that loves using the phrase, the political is personal. That's a common phrase that exists within Marxist thought. And I think the reason for it is because they're trying to argue using Gramsci's own viewpoint, and they don't realize they're actually kind of pulling this a little bit from the fascists, is that there's no distinction between the two, and that attempts to draw a distinction is what's creating kind of this solidified culture that the Marxists themselves are trying to get rid of. And so by drawing the state into the sphere of the personal and the political, you're pulling everything into a position where they even if they don't want to be, even if people don't want to be, they're being forced into a war of position, even if they don't realize it.
So again, it's this idea of we're especially in the United States, we've always, I know, especially from the conservative tradition in the United States, it's been, this is the realm of government, and the realm of government is supposed to stay within. That's why we talk about limited and enumerated powers within the Constitution. We're constantly obsessed with this idea that jurisdiction. And the jurisdiction is not just different levels of government. The jurisdiction, at least that I've always talked about, is also what I call the province. There's the province of God, there's the province of the government, there's the province of the individual, there's the province of the family, there's the province of civic organizations. It's this idea that society is not simply your government. Society is a group of people living in kind of cooperation and coordination with one another. And a government, this goes back to our Declaration of Independence, right? They're formed amongst men in order to secure their liberties, right? In order to create an environment where they can operate safely under common laws and things of that nature. And what they're saying is like, no, not really. It's that all of this stuff is the state. And so it's this concept that, again, what you're talking about here is, and you see this in the West, whereas we're constantly saying to the left, do what you want, just don't include me, or do what you want, but you don't get to subsidize it through the government, or do what you want, but you don't get to write it into code. And they're coming back with, no, it has to be. Right? There is no separate this over there.
They don't draw a distinction.
Because they don't draw the distinction between the state and civil society.
When they say state, they don't just mean the government. They also mean the movies you watch, the music you listen to, the news that you get. They view all of that as, again, this is why I said that in some respects, it's actually kind of similar to fascism. This is coming straight out of Gentile here. They view all of that, your church that you go to, the grocery store that you shop at, all of that falls under the realm of the state. not just government and elected officials and laws.
And you can draw a straight line from that back to Marx too. I mean, so this is the idea now of how do they, okay, now that we've established that the intellectuals, within what you might call traditional intellectuals, but the organic ones within society, within those culturally shaping institutions, those are important because they're the ones that create culture. You need to be able to create a culture around what you want, your philosophy, in this case, Marxist philosophy, because you're not just fighting an economic system, you're fighting a competing culture. The reason why Marx was wrong about how this stuff would develop in other countries is because whenever they tried the armed revolution, they didn't have sufficient popular support. And what he's come to the conclusion is, well, yeah, you didn't have sufficient popular support because you didn't give people the true comprehensive sense of belonging. That's where you have to merge the state and the civil, because everyone has to be a part of the fight. You got to pick a side. And what they're going to do is they're going to, create an environment to where now, okay, we are the predominant culture. We've won the war of position, and now we can fully take over, and there's nowhere to hide because we've essentially removed those distinctions between what you might call the government and civil society. It's all now included. So he's done all this, and this goes into the next part, which he didn't coin the term, but when the term was coined, it was with Gramsci in mind. It was this idea when we talk about the long march through the institutions. The long march is a throwback to Mao's long march as he was fleeing the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek. And the communists essentially, they went through this process of, they were on the ropes. They had been essentially defeated. And the Long March was this very, very difficult struggle that they went through to kind of win the hearts and minds of the population, come back, and eventually win. So the Long March through the institutions, a way to think about that is it's understanding that Gramsci was right. And so now what we have to do is simultaneously destroy the current culturally shaping institutions. You can do that by one of two ways. You can undermine them, or you can infiltrate them and use them for your own purposes in order to create a new culture which will allow you to finally, adopt Marxism and to create the sort of conditions which are necessary for Marxism to flourish. So next we're going to talk about kind of the long march through the institutions that has happened here within the United States. But first, I want to tell you about an organization that I really admire and have worked with closely for years now, and that is Live Action. I know there's a lot of us that are thrilled that Planned Parenthood is no longer getting our tax dollars. But did you know that's only for 1 year? That's right. It was taken out of this budget. It was taken out for 1 year. That doesn't mean that it can't come back. And you better believe that Planned Parenthood and the abortion industry is going to continue to fight for it, because the dirty little secret is they are absolutely dependent on your tax dollars for their survival. But Live Action is one of the premier organizations that has been going out there making the argument culturally for why we need to defend innocent human life and why we have a responsibility. If we want to preserve the sort of culture that we want to actually raise our families in, if we want to preserve the sort of culture that embraces families instead of destroys them, then we need to get behind the organizations that have been fully involved in that fight, not just politically, but culturally. And Live Action has done an incredible job. I highly encourage you to go over to Live Action, go over to their website, look at some of the videos and the cultural engagement that they've done. Also, I would encourage you to text Nick to 70723 to get more information. If you would like to join and help Live Action in their mission, you can do $20 for 2025, right? 2025, it's the whole year, 2025. They're going to send you a free mug. We all know how I love my mugs, right? They're going to send you a free mug about defending the babies, saving life. Go over to text Nick to 70723, do a monthly gift of $20.25. They're going to send you their free Live Action mug, and you're going to be helping an organization that I think has done one of the best jobs of anybody out there in the history of the pro-life movement to be able to defend the innocent and has actually made tangible progress. Go check them out right now. Okay, the long march through the institutions.
So you're right that it was Rudi Dutschke in the 1960s in Germany that coined the term. And Dutschke was pulling straight from Gramsci.
The freaking Germans, man.
So, I mean, but what's interesting is that And this is an area where you and I might disagree because we've talked about this a little bit before, but I think we're at the end of this.
So let's go ahead and talk about what this is, and we're going to kind of move into our analysis of Gramsci and the status of our country. So we talked about all the necessary preconditions. The Long March was the process. This was the process of them fighting to either control or dismantle the culturally shaping institutions, which they believe prop up capitalism and, in our view, the kind of the American view of the world. And to replace it with a socialist one, with more of a Marxist-oriented one. And Christian's argument is that when you look at the Long March to the institutions, they've essentially completed it. And look, I think you can make a very convincing argument that when it comes to, let's just list off some culturally shaping institutions, and we'll ask all of us here, do we think that the left has attained sufficient ideological capture? So Hollywood.
Oh, yeah, that's gone.
Christian says yes.
I think you have to caveat with, because I think we see things going a different direction right now, and moving away. So before that moving away started, yes.
Okay, so we'll do this. Christian says,
because we are all seeing how legacy media is now failing. We're seeing that there's alternative things, and so because we're seeing that, we needed to kind of take a step back and go, like, before that initiated, where were we?
I don't disagree, but I want to separate. You said legacy media. I want to separate Hollywood, that like arts and entertainment. Well, maybe that's a broader category, from journalism. So arts and entertainment. Are you saying partial capture, sufficient capture, or there's a rebellion taking place?
I feel full capture.
Full capture.
Full
okay.
capture.
So you both agree with full capture. I would say that when we look at Hollywood as an institution, full capture for the most part. You got some things out there that are a little, some studios that are kind of fighting back and whatnot. But I do think that there's an element within arts and entertainment that we're starting to see this organic rebellion taking place. Nerdrotic talks a lot about it. Critical Drinker talks a lot about it, where now we actually have mechanisms for other people to start to compete with those studios, which I think is encouraging. But I tend to agree that you would be hard pressed to find any, real positive, messaging out of Hollywood.
I think it's full capture, and now anything else that you're starting to see is a response to that full capture.
Well, that's arguably, and we're jumping ahead a little bit, but that's
not,
arguably the unraveling.
Wait, stop. We're not going to jump ahead. So I had your answers. We answered that. And the next one is journalism or journalism or media.
Totally fully captured.
Yeah, same thing.
I disagree because I think that as much as you had like your, I think you saw the rebellion on that one actually start earlier with Fox News. And it's not to say that Fox News doesn't have its own.
That's if you don't think that Fox News is controlled opposition.
That's fine. I don't. I don't think that you can argue that Fox News has been fully captured within the long march of the institutions. And I think that one of the things that we saw with Fox News and one of the things that we saw with kind of what you might call punditry on talk radio and things like that is that there had been a fairly complete capture of mainstream media and the big three networks. And then when you started the cable news come on and there was alternatives, you actually started to see a pushback. So I'm not going to give them full capture on journalism. I think it's near full capture.
Okay, so a little bit of clarification is needed here.
Yeah.
The mere existence of Fox News, I think, actually reinforces my point about journalism being captured. When we say that an institution has been ideologically captured basically by cultural Marxists, that the long march to the institutions has been completed and Gramsci has kind of gotten his way on this, that's not to say that there's not opposition that exists. There was opposition in Italy to Mussolini in the 1920s within the communist left, but Mussolini was still in charge, right? Gramsci was in prison, but that's not to say that there weren't communists out there that were like Gramsci that were opposed to Mussolini, but they did not have control over the culture. They did not have control over the legislature, the courts, or the government, or the military, or anything like that. And so,
well, before we get too far down this road, I'm not claiming that it has to be 100% capture to be sufficient, right? And maybe we haven't articulated what that looks like. I would say when you have like overwhelming supermajorities, which means it's not just that the institution has been captured, but the people that actually give that institution credibility, they're the most popular within society. So what I'm saying is that what Fox News represented within journalism when it got going, as well as some other outlets, is that while there was a significant capture, Fox News' almost instant popularity demonstrated that they hadn't fully, I don't think they'd fully completed that circle in the way that they have in, say, the next area that I would bring up, which is academia.
I'm just going to push back a little bit here.
Yeah.
And the reason why is because when Fox blew onto the scene, it was not considered real news. That's why Trump does the whole fake news thing, is because originally when Fox came on the scene, all the big media outlets basically acted as though Fox was fake, just silly, stupid clown news.
They all operated in tandem to attack Fox.
And I'm going to also push back because obviously there are some print medias that are kind of notoriously right-leaning, but they never had the credibility that the true legacy media had. You know, you had Washington Post always was, they're legit, you know, the New York Times, all of these. And we had counterbalances to it, but they were never considered very as serious. You've got AP News literally took over every single print media. Even our local paper, all it does is recycle AP news outlets or news articles. And so ours is Culpeper Star Exponent. It recycles anything that comes out of Richmond Times Dispatch, who recycles everything that comes from AP News. And so what I'm saying is they were a big, giant force that, and I think we started to see the tide turn a little bit there with Fox News, with a few different alternatives, but they really had captured up until that point.
Well, let's say maybe it would be easier if we did this. Let's say pre-COVID, post-COVID. Is that fair? As kind of a line of demarcation, because I do believe that there was some changes that took place post-COVID.
Okay, so BC and
so pre, yeah.
BC
I don't know if I again, I think we're getting a little bit ahead. I think that a lot of this peaked in arguably 2021 or 2022. But again, think about it from this way.
Well, hang on. Here's the problem. We need to define our terms.
Yes, I know. Think about it this way. When Fox News came along, it was known for putting a conservative viewpoint to the news.
Yeah.
Whereas ABC, CBS, CNN, they're the news.
They just considered themselves the news.
And so that is what Gramsci's getting at here. And so when I say that the news has been captured, it's not that there's not conservative news out there. It's that there's conservative news out there. The news is leftist. It's progressive. It's not conservative. And we don't call it until recently liberal media. That's kind of a relatively recent term. For a long time, they just called it the news.
Yeah.
That's exactly what Gramsci's looking for.
Okay.
The long march to the institutions is not to say everybody's going to go out there and say, man, we have a liberal Hollywood. No, we have Hollywood. And we have conservative alternative entertainment. We don't have liberal news. We have the news, and we have conservative news.
So the overall point that you're making here, which I think is a very good one that you're both making, is that, look, regardless of whether or not there's the fact that we label the alternative to that as conservative demonstrates the point that they've got the capture.
Yes.
Okay, that's fair. All right. So arts and entertainment captured, news captured. That's the argument. Academia, that's one that I feel has been captured. And again, it's
for a
not,
long time.
It's not because we don't have Hillsdale or Liberty.
It's because
or
we have Hillsdale.
It's because those are seen as alternative forms of education. They're not even seen as they're not just another institution. They're a conservative institution, whereas all the other ones are seen as just mainstream. And where in real, no one would label University of Virginia as, oh no, that's the left wing university, and Liberty is the right wing. It's no, that's a Christian university, and that's just a university.
Right.
So I totally agree on academia. I think it's been total capture.
Especially you can't. I mean, even going into medical school or anything that is you absolutely have to have the education in order to go into this field. These highly technical fields. Even there, you're getting all of the left garbage, like all of the left indoctrination. So it's like, it's not just in your sociology department, right? It's permeating through the entire institution.
Okay, now next one, public school system.
Yes, captured.
Captured.
I agree.
Same thing as the universities.
Well, yeah, but I'm making a distinction, right? Academia, because for a long time, that was not necessarily the case. Right? For a long time, at the same time that your university system was pushing out some pretty radical stuff, kids were still saying a prayer in school. Now, maybe, I think that really started to change in the 50s, but I want to make the distinction because I think it's appropriate. So we agree, academia captured, public school captured. Okay. Next one is the church.
Halfway captured.
Yeah, halfway captured. Not done yet is what I'm saying. Not done yet. Because here's the thing is, some of these other areas, it's further down the road, so the pendulum's finally swinging back, like getting ready to swing back. Whereas in the church, I don't think it's done.
I think there's something interesting too about the church, but I want to swing back around to it after I get to these last two. All right, the bureaucracy, the federal or the government bureaucracy,
totally captured.
Total capture, one of the first
totally
to be captured. The last one I'm going to throw out, or the last one I'm going to throw out there as kind of a You might say, well, why didn't you include that with the bureaucracy? And it's because there is its own unique culture, and that's the military.
Higher ups captured. Low-level officers partially captured. The
rank and file.
The rank and file will probably never be captured.
No, like I semi-agree with that. I don't even think all the higher-ups are captured fully. I think the military has been like the one long-standing holdout, and the attempt at capture of the military is one of the things that caused the pendulum to swing back.
Okay, so now this is interesting because if we look at this, we look at arts and entertainment, we look at the bureaucracy, we look at academia, public education, we look at all these culturally shaping institutions, and we kind of instantly say, yep, captured, pretty strong ideological capture there. And then we say the two that were like, not as much, the church and the military. Here's what I noticed that's kind of interesting about these. When we talk about the news, when we talk about academia, when we talk about public education, when we talk about arts and entertainment, we're talking about fields that do not necessarily have an underlying commitment to a particular worldview. They do not have, there's not an inherent.
They're not culturally shaping.
Well, okay, that I totally.
The church is, but the military is not culturally shaping.
Stop. Let me get to where I'm going on this, because I didn't say the military. I said these other ones. Okay. I think arts and entertainment is absolutely culturally shaping. Absolutely. The difference is that it's an institution that does not have an inherent worldview. It adopts the worldview of the culture that it's in. The church does. In fact, for the vast majority of human history, the church has been the institution that does provide the transcendent link to objective truth and objective morality. So it's culturally shaping and informative in the way that I think has been overall the most resistant, especially to a secular form that's trying to replace it. Because as Gramsci even said, he wanted socialism to be the religion that replaces Christianity, which means socialism was now supposed to provide you your objective sense of truth, morality, meaning, identity, purpose, etc.
This is where wokeism comes from.
And that's what we're going to get into. When you look at all the institutions that were captured first, they were targeted in part because they're culturally shaping, but because they're not necessarily rooted, especially within our culture, within a classically liberal society. They are not, by definition, rooted in an objective worldview. It's almost like a neutral place where you debate these ideas, or you express them, or you talk about them, or you report on them, right? And what we found is that when the left got into these institutions, they were not neutral. They were not neutral. The military is unique, and I always kind of wonder, why does the military culture thrive? And I think one of the reasons why they don't have capture of it in the modern version of this socialist is because it's woke, right? If you look, the communists had full capture of the military as an institution. Now, again, the military is not so much a shaping institution as it is an enforcement mechanism, or maybe a reflection of your society. But what's interesting about that is that in order for socialism to fully capture the military within the societies that it did, and it did, it was pro-masculine. It had a very martial culture, armed revolution. There
Notice how there's prerequisites for, you have to do something to take over the military, any military. You don't get to mold it to be, I mean, in a way you can. I mean,
the
I'm sure that
really did try.
There's elements of the Canadian and British militaries that are extremely emasculated at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But they're also inept. Like the UK could be invaded tomorrow and probably would be conquered because the government is, I think, totally incapable. I mean, they're currently being invaded.
Mm-hmm.
What are we talking about? Like, this is happening right now. Like they're being flooded with migrants legally and illegally, and nobody's stopping it.
But do you see the point I'm trying to make, right? Like, when you look at all these other culturally shaping institutions, no inherent anchor in something objectively true or objectively moral.
Yes, to your point, like, I'll use the Soviet Union as an example of this. We can point out all day long that there were evil atrocities that the Soviet Union committed. Obviously, it was very inefficient. We've also talked about that. The economic calculation problem. The Soviet Union chronically suffered from that. They had shortages. Capitalism is inherently a superior system than communism in terms of delivering economic prosperity. But on a spiritual side, and this is a bit weird because Marxism claims to be an atheistic, materialistic philosophy, or ideology. But as Gramsci points out, Gramsci's not into that as much. He's a Marxist, but again, he's an atheist, but he's not a materialist.
Mm-hmm.
He does think that there's an element, there's a spiritual component to humanity as what actually gives meaning and purpose to the world, and the world kind of springs forth from that. Well, there's always a martial culture. Doesn't matter the society. Any successful military, and for all of its faults, the Soviet Union had a successful military. They resisted the largest land invasion in history. And they resisted that.
Mm-hmm.
They won. They suffered 27 million casualties, but they won on the Eastern Front in World War II. And you can point to like Afghanistan and stuff like that.
Sure.
But the fact is that the Soviet Union absolutely had military successes.
Mm-hmm.
They cultivated a martial culture, a masculine culture. There was an element to the Soviet Union that was not woke.
Yeah.
It was inefficient. It was divorced from what we would say is Christian morality.
It ignored
but
certain aspects of human nature. It did not ignore all
other aspects of human nature. And then the martial, masculine aspects of human nature and the power that flows forth from those things, the Soviet Union embraced those things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the reason why wokeism will never fully co-opt the military, in part because it's antithetical to those things.
Not 100%. And the reason why is because a lot of, so within I would say the overarching church, I don't mean the church as in Christ Church, I mean the church as in the Christian influenced churches of the society,
which you might call cultural Christianity.
Yes. And so we have various denominations that were more prone to being captured.
Mm-hmm.
Just like in the military, we have certain MOSs that are more prone to being captured in certain positions, especially desk jockey positions and things like that, like people that are pushing papers up at the top or whatever it might be, that are a lot more prone to this kind of capture. And oh, by the way, it's partially because they had to make everything much softer for all the women that they put in. And so, and not to say that it's, I'm not saying
women can't serve. But
I'm not saying there's not jobs women should be doing. It's just that when you infuse a lot of women into certain areas, that whole area gets softer. It just does. And so, the whole woke military thing. I mean, you look at some of the commercials they were coming out with talking about, my two moms and I have mental health issues and all of this. And it's like they were really driving toward trying to capture that. And it always came through inserting women into positions and saying it's just not fair that women can't be, in combat arms or whatever it might be. And so we need to lower all of the standards. Well, when you lower all the standards, you then capture more people that are below the standard.
Well, you also dissuade people that want to live up to those standards from joining, because why would I join an organization that is not actually committed to doing what it's supposed to do?
Yeah.
And so at the same time you're dissuading the sort of people that you would theoretically want to be in your military, you're opening it up to other people that might might possess mental health issues that don't make it conducive, or might not have the right motivations. I will tell you right now, I say this and I mean it absolutely. When I ask somebody, why do you want to join the military? And they say the college money, I'm like, I wish you wouldn't join. It's not that I don't want you to take the college money or enjoy the college money or utilize it. It's just that if that's your primary, that's your primary incentive for serving, you're probably not the sort of person I want to get in a gunfight with. Right?
You know, the other thing that's left out of this conversation,
or depend on in a gunfight,
is that it's not just that the military is harder to capture, it's that the military is the last thing you capture too.
Mm-hmm.
Go back to war of position versus war of maneuver. Well, the war of position is you take over the culturally shaping institutions, and then you engage in a war of maneuver.
Yeah.
So the military is the war of maneuver, but you need to hijack the culture first. You can leave the military for last. You take over the schools, you take over the newspapers, you take over TV, you take over media, you take over Hollywood, you conquer the culture, and then you can work your way through the military and then engage in a war of maneuver and institute the type of world that Gramsci wants. But the last thing I'll say is, and I brought this up briefly earlier, the military is simply not culturally shaping.
No.
Not nearly to the degree that the university and the structure and the media is. And so those are more important. Ironically enough, the guys with the guns are the last group you go after.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need to have guns to conquer a country, is what Gramsci's trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
And the Marxists are losing, when he's writing this in the 30s, outside of Russia, they're losing because they think we need to go grab the guns and take to the streets. But that you're never going to succeed that way in the West.
Well,
you need to take over the university system in the media, and you conquer those, and then the military will eventually just be on your side. You won't even need to fight in the streets.
Let me even say this, because it's certainly, I don't think you're implying this, but I don't want anybody to think that you can't conquer a country with a military that happens to be communist, because the Soviets did that, right? They were able to take over countries through sheer force.
This happened in Afghanistan,
right? Well, and you even saw areas in Eastern Europe that didn't necessarily want to be communist, or want to be completely subservient to the Soviet Union, and yet that's what happened. The problem was, and I think this is the other thing Gramsci is talking about that actually makes this a lot more deeper philosophically than just a strategy, because two things you have to recognize. One, I don't think there's any such thing as a Marxist revolution that doesn't eventually involve bloodshed. I think it's inherent. I don't care how many culturally shaping institutions that they get. And one of the things that we're seeing in the United States right now is that it's fragile, especially when it goes off on the strange kind of weird postmodern critical theory, woke expression that we've seen of Marxism in this. So bloodshed's always baked into the equation. Marx would certainly believe that bloodshed was always baked into the equation. But the other thing that you're seeing in the United States that gives me hope, or excuse me, let me go back to this. What Gramsci was saying is that even if you conquer it through violent revolution, you still haven't dealt with the underlying conditions necessary in order to make Marx's ideal possible. You have to have so even if you conquer with the military, you're still going to have to go through the process of developing that culture in order to make the new socialist man a reality. This has been, if you look at what's going on in the United States right now and in other parts of the West, this has been probably the most faithful execution of Gramsci's roadmap that they could have asked for. If you take the United States, which was seen as the leader of the free world in direct opposition to communism, like nothing was clearer than Reagan versus Gorbachev, right? The U.S. versus the Soviet. Nothing was clearer. This was going to be the thing that was going to decide this concept of free people, free markets versus the Soviet system and Marxism. And the Soviet Union collapsed under its own weight, along with the pressures that the United States and the West put on it. It collapsed. There was no question in anyone's mind when that wall came down who was running in which direction. Nobody was desperately fighting to get over to Eastern Germany when that wall was up. But you had all kinds of people fighting, laborers, right? The laborers' paradise, fleeing to get to capitalist countries. There was no better representation, not of the perfection of capitalism in Western society, but the superiority of it. Absolutely. No question. No question. And yet, And yet, within a few short decades, the left had managed to completely rehabilitate Marx and go about this process, which had started during the Cold War. It had started during the Cold War. The Soviets had actively pushed for it. And Yuri Bezmenov talks about this, and we've got a whole episode that talks about it. But their effort outlived the regime that pushed the effort. And it lived on and continued to work and rehabilitated itself after the fall of the Soviet Union and was able to achieve a level of capture that should have been ridiculous to even dream of after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union. And yet, here we are. However, something happened. This is my theory, and this is going to be the last thing we discuss. Something happened that I don't think anybody counted on, which I think completely upset this process. And that was COVID. Now, the reason I believe this, I'm going to lay out a very quick argument for this. What Gramsci understood is that if you can subtly take over these institutions gradually and over time, right? It's the old analogy of you're turning up the water, right? And it's boiling before you know it. If you do this gradually and over time, it just becomes the normal state of things.
You adopt it for yourself.
You adopt it for yourself. Why? Because it's the social sea in which you swim. If I go to school and my teachers tell me that I can identify as whatever I want, and you're mean if you don't affirm that, well, now all of a sudden we can throw out centuries of knowledge on biology and norms and everything else and science and objective reasoning and logic and linear thing. We can throw all of that out. Why? It's just the social sea in which I swim. I'm rewarded for saying these things. I'm punished for saying these things. And this is the cultural this is the cultural hegemony in which I exist. And if I would like to be successful within that cultural hegemony, these are the ideas and concepts that I adopt. And I shouldn't think too much about them. That's what hegemony means. It's dogma at this point. You don't question these things. Questioning them makes you a bad person. And that is where we were headed. That is where we were at. I watched it in real time in a state legislature. I watched it as arguments that would have been absurd 5 years old. In fact, I watched it as people who told me, hey, I think something weird is going on here, and I think it's going to lead to this. That's ridiculous, Nick. You're being divisive. You're hyperbolic. What was it? The cultural hegemony spotted people that were saying things you weren't supposed to say and turned on you. And I don't mean the left. I mean people in my own party. I mean people in my own church. Nick, you're being divisive. You can't do that. Don't do that. That's upsetting things. That is capture. That is capture. But then when COVID happened, something disrupted the system. And what it did was it demonstrated to a large portion of the population. Whereas if you weren't reading Gramsci, if you had no idea who Gramsci was,
and a lot of leftists don't even know.
If you had no idea what cultural Marxism was, if you didn't, all you knew is that 1 minute you had some faith in these things. Yeah, college universities are a little bit liberal, but that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to be quirky, right? If you're young and not a liberal, you have no heart. If you're old and not a conservative, you have no brain, right? And yeah, the HR department's getting a little weird. And yeah, of course, Hollywood is going to elevate certain things. That's what they're supposed to do. They kind of challenge the social norms, and we kind of get through it because that's just who we are. And look, we believe in a free and open society. And then all of a sudden, overnight, they could shut down your church. They could fire you. They were talking about taking your kids away, and they were serious about it. Right? All of a sudden, you got a window on what was being talked about in your public schools. And what seemed like absurd when you heard it, because you went to public school and nothing like that happened. Oh, give me a break. I've met my kid's kindergarten teacher, and yeah, she might be a little, loopy, but she's a nice lady, and she likes our kids. And then all of a sudden, they got a window, and it's like, you're telling my kids what?
I agree with you that COVID was the turning point here, because
COVID broke. What COVID did was, for all the people that were watching what was going on and saying, guys, there's something going on. We were crazy. We were conspiracy theorists. Why? Because the very institutions told them we were conspiracy theorists. And it sounded weird. It sounded loony. And then all of a sudden, they got to see a glimpse of it. And as they went down, I was like, oh my gosh, it's true. Yes.
So there's this meme that kind of exists on X every now and then, where somebody on the left is bringing up something that Trump has done that they don't like, right? Something about deportations or gutting the bureaucracy or something. And a lot of times they'll get ratioed by some random no-name person, that has 800 followers. And they'll just simply say something like, you should have left our video games alone.
Yeah.
And to your point, real hegemony is not, in the West at least, it is not that your party wins every election. It's that the other party executes your agenda even when they win.
Yeah.
And for a long time, the Republican Party was conserving progressivism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that COVID accelerated, they went too hard and too fast and too short of a time. And it broke for a lot of people. They realized, oh, I don't actually believe in these things. I'm not swimming in some current that I belong to. Something's being imposed upon me by foreign outside forces. And I don't mean foreign as in other countries, but external forces are imposing a worldview upon me and demanding that I adopt it for my own. And for a long time, for decades, we were just moving in a more progressive direction, and people kind of adopted it for their own. They kind of came around to accepting it themselves of their own volition. Nobody forced them to do it.
Yeah.
Nobody forced the American people to accept gay marriage, but the polling showed that the American people came around to accepting it. That's because of cultural Marxism. That's because, I'm sorry, people are going to be offended by that, but that's the case.
Yeah.
That's because of Gramsci's worldview. But you know what's interesting now? The polling is showing that support for gay marriage is dropping. It's still over 50%, but it has collapsed with Republicans. And you know why? Because a younger group of Republicans have concluded that, 10 years ago, I might have supported gay marriage, but now I realize that wasn't me that came up with that idea. I was kind of fooled into accepting that idea by I'm using one example, by a external force that kind of imposed it upon me. And you know what? They crossed a line when it went to kids, when it went to transing kids. And so now here's where the left really screwed up. Because now you have a group, they're still a minority on the right, but you now have a group that's saying, no, we want to repeal all of it. Not just the insanity of COVID, we want to repeal the 20th century. We want to repeal all of progressivism, all of it. And that terrifies the left. When they look at the public approval, polling, and I used gay marriage as an example, they're absolutely terrified of the fact that the Republican side of that, Democrats, it's like 90%, right? On the Republican side, it went as high as like 60-something% in like 2021 at the peak of wokeism. And now it's down to like 41%. It's falling on the right. After they came around to adopting it. And what's happened is that the left does not realize they have created the very reactionaries that they now accuse of being like fascists or whatever.
Well,
they've created the backlash against them.
Well, and because they spent so much time accusing any sort of opposition, no matter how mild, as being fascism, right? Like,
or being right-wing extremism.
Yeah, Mitt Romney was literally Hitler. Like, now when they say it, nobody cares. Nobody cares. In fact, in some cases, it gets a little bit scary when they've denigrated people so much and they keep holding up the Nazis as the opposition to them. You actually have some people that don't know any better going, well, then what did they have to say? Because I don't like you either. But here's the thing I want to get to very briefly, and that is, I think what we've seen is they made two fatal flaws. One is they moved way too fast. Right. You still had too many people that were not necessarily on board with the overall agenda, but were just kind of going along in their daily lives. And COVID created this kind of event that could not be ignored, where they took off the mask. No pun intended. They took off the mask, and now people are, again, not woke, awake. It's like, nope, you are everything. Who's that one rapper? He's like an independent rapper, and he goes, you're just as crazy as every conservative told me you were. And that's something where you have a lot of people that, again, what they call the normies or whatever else, the people who are just living their lives. Those are the ones that, again, they got the message. It was like, okay, this is real. At the same time that this now a massive part of the population is now engaged, the left is also waking up to the reality that we have picked a culture that doesn't work. It's not capable of sustaining itself. You cannot build a dominating culture that is capable of actually governing around people that are bragging about how many identities and mental illnesses they have. right? That's what Yuri Bezmenov called the useful idiots. They were the people that were good for disrupting culture, for demoralizing culture. That was specifically the word he used. These people are used for demoralizing culture, but as soon as your side wins, the way he worded it was, you liquidate that aspect of your movement because they're not good for anything except demoralization. Well, the vanguard of their proletariat is the useful idiots. They're not people that can run society. They're not people that can fight. They can't do an armed resistance. They're not even.
So how does the
They
left
also can't govern.
So how does I want to know, because the left is doing this play by play. How do they liquidate that?
They don't.
No, they don't.
Element.
Because there's no KGB agent on board this train to purge the useful idiots because the Soviet Union collapsed 30 years ago. That's kind of the interesting thing here. The train has no brakes anymore. The idea from the Soviet perspective, I'm not saying Gramsci was doing this, but Gramsci kind of sets in motion what's happening in terms of, the crazy people kind of taking over. But the Soviets kind of co-opted this, to your point about Bezmenov, in the 80s, well, arguably the 70s. And they're like, oh yeah, we'll destabilize the West, and then our agents will be the ones that will pull the brakes on the train once we get to a position to seize power. And that's when you have the KGB guys and the jackboots come in and just line them up on the wall. Their own people, arguably their own people. Because to your point, they're useful idiots that have outlived their usefulness.
Yeah, and this is not us speculating about this. Yuri Bezmenov laid it out like, oh yeah, this is what active measures was.
But the Soviet Union is gone.
Yeah.
The KGB is gone. There are no competent Marxists, ruthless, bloodthirsty, cold-hearted, people operating from a realpolitik standpoint to purge the useful idiots. And so what's only happened is that the train's just careening down the tracks and there's no conductor on board. There's nobody just to pull the brakes or anything like that. And so this is how you get to the insanity that you see during COVID. And so in the places in America where these people are in charge, what do you see is just a total breakdown in standard of living and law and order. And
I mean, some of the people in charge of those places who have championed every single thing that this rabid group has wanted to do are now trying to remake themselves in the conservative image. Did you guys see that Gavin Newsom went on Sean Ryan and he was gifted a gun and he's like not sure how to hold the thing, and he's like, I respect this gift. He wants to run for freaking president and he has to figure out how to shake the useful idiots off his person because he never believed any of it anyway. We knew he didn't because he was shutting everything down and going and partying it up himself. Well, he didn't really believe the crap he was saying. He was just doing what his side told him they needed to do, and he got caught.
I think this is the next thing I'm looking for on the left's reaction to all of this, right? Because there are some people on the left that are true believers. Bernie Sanders is a true believer in the Marxist ideal. I think AOC is a true believer in the Marxist ideal.
Mondani
is a true believer in the Marxist ideal. Gavin Newsom, I think, is more just a political animal. He's definitely of the left, but he's more pragmatic. He wants power.
He's of Gavin Newsom.
Sure, but
he's not a cultural Marxist. He's just a liberal Democrat.
But I don't think it's fair enough. I don't think it's fair enough to say that. I do believe that he tends to believe in certain things. It's just like I put him in the same category as Kamala Harris. It's just that he's a lot smarter than Kamala Harris.
He's a leftist pragmatist.
He wants power, and he will do what needs to be done to get power. But it wasn't just Gavin. I mean, think about it. When AOC removed the pronouns from her bio after the Trump election, that was because she saw, this group of useful idiots is no longer beneficial to my overall agenda. Now, that didn't mean she threw them overboard. It didn't mean because she can't. She needs different ones. Like, she still needs them. She just understands that she can't be married to them. She can't be wholly identified by them. She still needs them in the camp. They just can't be in front anymore. Because you'll notice this with Democrats, right? They always have a new victim group that they're rolling out. And that victim group stays prominent to the degree that they're useful for the overall mission. What's the overall mission? Read Gramsci. Gramsci will give you insight into why these various issues, the issue is never the issue is always the revolution, why these various groups fall in favor and out of favor. So that's what it is. But now what you're going to start to see is some people waking up. The true believers are going to wake up to, okay, we got to pivot. And they're trying now. This like, how do we win back men? And they're doing it really, really sloppy because they've married themselves so much to this that they're not quite sure how to re-engage. But I guarantee you, they're gonna try for the economic populism component again. They're gonna swing more to the economic. That's what Mamdani is doing in New York City right now. He's still married to all the other crap, but that's what they're trying to do. They also see a split within MAGA when it comes to foreign intervention, when it comes to Palestine and Israel. They're going to try to exploit that. But here's the good news. Here's the good news. We've seen what the problem is. All right, they have a fatal flaw. Gramsci came up. This is what should encourage all of us. Gramsci came up with arguably the single best roadmap for achieving what they want. And what it ended with was a bunch of blue hair, they, them screaming in the street. And eventually it's starting to collapse in and on itself. Because ultimately what Marx failed to do and what Gramsci never realized, Marx failed to understand what truly motivates human nature. Because what Marx was doing was not just coming up with an economic system. Marx was coming up with an alternative religion. And that religion ignores the very aspects of, he got it wrong. Not all of his critiques were incorrect, but he got the fundamental question of objective truth, morality, God, he got it wrong. And then he tried to build something. He tried to build an ideology around a false foundation. So he's wrong. They just threw arguably some of their best at us. Right? Perfect execution of Gramsci's model. And it took an epidemic. I'm not going to say it took something as big as COVID, but when people started to realize that, they started to rebel. Now there's a lot of work to be done. But the good news is people are awake to it now. And so what do you need in order to beat what they did? It's Gramsci in reverse. Right? But here's the difference. They're trying to build an entire apparatus around this like hyper secular, egalitarian, atheistic view of the world that ultimately cannot provide you objective truth and morality. It can provide you the power of the state and consensus. But the consensus will always rest with an elite. That's what we saw with every communist attempt. What did you see? You saw hierarchy, you saw elite, you saw the very things that communism was established to destroy.
They're a bit hypocritical, aren't they?
And you saw it in the worst possible forms. Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, Castro. These were not happy-feely leaders. These were people that brutally oppressed and murdered, in some cases, hundreds of thousands, in other cases, tens of millions of their own people, in order to hold on to power and establish and maintain their hierarchy.
Yeah, which is the very reason they were able to assert it long term. And they don't have that here.
So what's the alternative? Well, the alternative, if you actually have a culture rooted in faith, if you actually have a culture rooted in something that's transcendent, this belief that like, no, there is a God, there is an objective truth, there is an objective order. We have roles and responsibilities within that order. And they're not all the same. We may have equal value before God, but we don't have equal roles and responsibilities in the sense that they're the same. It's not equal in similarity. It may be equal in value in many cases, but it's not equal in similarity. And now we're getting back to this idea where people are saying, you know what? I'm sorry, I'm tired of all the experts. I'm even tired of this even the hyper-egalitarian component of classical liberalism. I'm looking for a created order. And that's what I want to fight for. Because when I see the people who adopt it and who faithfully live it out, I see something I want to replicate. I see something that you can build a family from. I see something that you can build a community from. I see something that you can build a nation from.
And that's why so many men are coming back. Basically, we're recapturing the men. Now, the left is still scrambling, trying to pick up the pieces on all of this. They realize they've lost men. So, of course, they hired a woman to try to figure out how to win men back.
Yeah.
And so they're still like throwing everything at the wall, hoping something sticks with men because they have so thrown out like whole cloth, just thrown out masculinity.
The other thing too that they've done, I mean, it's just obvious that they've done this, is that they want open borders and mass migration, because if you can't win, if there's things in place that you cannot win back, like they can't win back I'm sorry, they can't win back young white men.
Mm-hmm.
They've literally built their entire political program around demonizing these people and saying, you're the one that's driving all the social ills in society. Imagine how cruel is it to tell an 18-year-old guy that he is the one who is responsible for all the evils in the world, that he's the one that secretly, because of his patriarchy and his whiteness, he's in charge. He has the power. He's 18.
Yeah.
He has no power. He has no money. He has no status. He hasn't done anything with his life yet because he's too young to have done anything with his life. I think it's quite frankly, I think it's evil to be telling a boy who's entering manhood that the whole world has him to blame for everything going wrong because of his race and his sex. Well, and you're never going to win those guys back. And so what do you do instead? Like they might attempt and pander and, oh, well, you know, abortion's also a men's issue. But at the end of the day, no, their next best thing is just import people that will be loyal to us because these guys here are never going to come back around to us.
Which they're finding out that in the UK, a lot of that.
How's that working out for you?
A lot of that they did with the Islamic population. What they found is that no, they were loyal to you until they got enough numbers.
And then they just vote for their own people.
Yeah, and like, I'm sorry, Labour Party, your heads will go on the pikes first, right? Like this is it. And here's what I'll say. The good news about this is that we now have a blueprint, or a blueprint is to look at what they attacked. What Marx attacked, first and foremost, he attacked God, he attacked the family, he attacked those traditional institutions, he attacked education. He wanted kids separated from their parents as early as possible. He didn't want them just educated communally. He wanted them raised communally because that was the only way they could actually create the new socialist man. And so what this tells us is that when we're building a culture rooted in God, right? And again, I'm a Christian. I'm going to advocate for Christianity. When you're rooted in God, when you're rooted in objective truth, objective morality, when you're rooted in strong families. So Marx wants to know God. I want God. He wants, communal families. I want traditional families. And then if we can start building from those building blocks and we can start doing that back, then that's what we recognize, right? Your larger communities, your larger societies are reflections on the health of the family. And so the more work and the more time we put into building up strong families, the more resilient they are to what they're doing. And ultimately they have a very, very difficult time winning against that. There's a reason why they recognize the dismantling of the family is an absolutely essential component of their overall objectives. Okay, look at what they're attacking, strengthen that. And I think, again, I think it's, I'm encouraged.
This is why we have to build parallel everything. We basically have to build a parallel society. And that starts with culturally shaping stuff. That starts with alternative ways to do education, alternative media. I mean, to your point, we're seeing this emerge right now, like podcasts, right? You're seeing conservative forms of entertainment and media. And remember when I said that, like, well, you have the media and then you have conservative media? Yeah. The goal should always be for conservative media to become the media. Yeah. I want to be in a position where people don't say, oh, that's the conservative version of X. I want people to say, that's X. Yeah.
Well, and I think but again, that starts with actually fighting back for those things and making them culturally relevant. And that's the part that I'm encouraged about. I really do think we're starting to see a resurgence where people, now we've got to be clever about this, right? If you're going to spend all of your time trying to take over an institution that's been completely captured, you may be wasting your time. You may want to set up a parallel. And again, it's never been easier to do some of this. The left said, we'll control academia and then we'll control the intelligentsia. It's like, okay, well, what if I don't need your academia? Well, they make that hard, right? Because you might need a license, you might need a certification, okay, but there's ways around that. Right? They might make it, well, we need your kid at younger ages in order to indoctrinate them in the way that we want them to see the world. Well, okay, now I'll homeschool. Now, again, you see some states where they're pushing back. They're trying to do greater restrictions. They understand they're in trouble. Please know this. They understand they're in trouble, which is why the last little vestiges of freedom that you have in some of these states to do things like homeschool, to do things like, come up with, alternatives. They're trying to restrict that. They're trying to make it more difficult to do those things. So that's where you need to take full advantage of the freedoms that you have to be able to build, again, within the institutions that we can still compete. Electoral politics is one of them because you have to. There's only one option. The government's the government. But entertainment, you don't got to go to the same old studios to do the same old things. There's alternatives. When it comes to journalism, you definitely don't got to go to the same old places to do the same old things. When it comes to academia, you don't got to go to the same old places to the same old things. It's never been easier to fight against the established studios, outlets, universities. Never been easier. So do it. So do it. And I think the more that we do it and the more we realize we're not alone in that process and the more we find the networks and the communities that are actually working on the same things, the more successful it becomes. One of the things that's, again, I'll end with this. This year in the General Assembly, this sounds like a bad thing, but I think it's actually a good thing in some way. Virginia was struggling. When you look at post-COVID, we had the worst recovery rates from COVID within our school system when it came to reading and math scores, worst in the country. And so there was all these mechanisms that we were going to use, and there was more money, and there was more accountability, and there was more everything, right? But all of it, generally speaking, operating within the current system that we had. Because, of course, you can't touch the current system. You can't challenge the current system. You can only give the current system more money because a lack of funds is the only thing that explains why the system isn't producing what it's supposed to produce. And then there was a bill this year. Now, homeschooling has not been it has not been a bane of the public school's existence. In fact, if anything, when you pull your kid out of public school, yes, there's certain funds that don't follow that kid into the public school, but they're actually getting more spending per pupil when you pull your kid out because you're still paying your property taxes. And a portion of that is still going into public education. It's not like you're getting to take it with you. So it wasn't as if homeschooling in Virginia was some grandiose threat to the public school system. It wasn't as if we were getting new legislation that was rapidly expanding options and school choice and dollars following. We were getting none of that. The public school was getting more and more and more money, despite the fact that they weren't producing very good results post-COVID. And then a state senator comes up with a bill. And what's her grandiose idea to assist with education? She essentially wants to get rid of a religious exemption. She wants to make superintendents responsible for determining whether or not you really qualify for religious exemption to homeschool. Now, why is that? Is it because there's just a whole host of kids that have been abused in the homeschool community? No. In fact, if we want to talk about abuse going on within the classroom, why don't we look at Loudoun County real quick in Virginia? No. What it was is they understand it's a threat because if you have options, you might not choose the one they're forcing on you. They understand where the threats are. So great. Let's do more to create the sort of environments where we make better men, better husbands, better fathers, better women, better wives, better mothers, because that makes stronger families. And I've seen the fruits of that. So now that we have a good idea of who Gramsci was, what he was trying to do, his perspective, and what our response should be to it, now that we've analyzed all that stuff, give us some more comments, give us some ideas on what you think that we should be doing, what should we be focusing on in order to push back, in order to take this unique moment in time to identify how we got here and to figure out the best ways to push back. We've given you ours. We'd love to hear from you. Once again, thank you for joining us. If you would like to be a part of our pregame and postgame and our inner circle, our inter-community, then go ahead and check out the link in the description. It's all in there. You can find out more about how to join up and how to be a part of our larger community, not just across the country, but actually across the world. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. We'll see you next episode.